With Election Day quickly approaching and the coronavirus pandemic still in full force, mail-in voting is more politically charged than ever.
Mail-in ballots are very dangerous. There's tremendous fraud involved and tremendous illegality.
The reality, this isn't a partisan issue. We have Republican secretaries of state like Michael Adams in Kentucky, who has said that vote by mail is the safest way to vote.
As increased election uncertainty begins to worry investors.
You know, it's interesting. I think the risks of the contested election are high.
As administration officials continue to encourage in-person voting across the nation.
People are very proud to show up and go to the polls. They really are. I mean, they wait in line at Georgetown Cupcake for an hour to get a cupcake.
State and local authorities warn of delays in the results.
Even if we did everything perfectly, we still have so many outstanding ballots that we won't know who the winner is in many races until probably Friday of election week.
Join us for a Bloomberg Special Report, 2020, Year of Crisis, Vote from Home. Hello and welcome. I'm Kevin Cirilli. Americans have been voting by mail since the Civil War. But in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, mail-in ballots have taken on new significance and partisanship. In this special report, we look into mail-in voting, the pros, the cons, the political debate, and the simple mechanics of delivering election results on November 3rd. We begin with an interview with Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, a moderate Republican.
You know, I think what we're doing here in Maryland is an all-of-the-above voting system where you can vote by mail, you can vote early with early voting, or you can vote on Election Day. We attempted to do a mail-in only situation in the primary elections, and there were some real difficulties with our independent state board of elections that couldn't administer it properly, and we had only a handful of precincts open that were overloaded and overcrowded, which was a tough situation. So this time we just decided to go forward with let's encourage everybody who can to vote by mail. If those who can't or don't want to can go to an early voting center, distance safe, with all the PPE that they need, and some people can still go and vote on Election Day. So if we spread it out over all three of those things, hopefully we'll give every single person a chance to vote, make sure we get maximum participation, and we'll do it in a safe way.
If people want to vote by mail, do they have the right to do so? Do they have to request a ballot?
We're going to send out an absentee ballot request to every single registered voter in the state.
A request?
Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned that there were some challenges. There's this debate that's been happening right now. I'm curious, is it your position that we're just too close to the election day to try to change this dramatically for the entire country? And are other governors saying that? And should this have been a conversation that was had 2 or 3 years ago as opposed to just a couple of months before November 3rd?
Well, you know, we're in this crisis, so it's a little bit, you know, we're trying to address the problems of keeping people safe while also encouraging people to vote. And so it's hard to figure it out, and each state is going about it a little bit differently, and I know there's a big argument about whether you should be able to vote by mail or not. We've been doing that for 20 years in our state, and it works very well. We're just trying to make it easier and encourage more people to do that, but there are a certain percentage of the people that, that still, as we showed in our primary, still want to show up and vote. We're going to make sure that they can do so in a safe way, but it's very difficult. So less than 110 days till the election, and to change all of the precincts across the country, it's an interesting debate, but it's also a challenging logistical problem.
As governors like Larry Hogan rush to bolster state election infrastructure, voting rights activists are trying to ensure that elections remain free and secure, even in a pandemic. Stacey Abrams is a former gubernatorial candidate in Georgia and chair of Fair Fight Action, an organization she founded to ensure voter protections. And just as a note, Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, is a contributor to Fair Fight Political Action Committee.
Well, the structural requirements are 3. 1, we have to have expanded access to mail-in ballots. Number 2, we have to have expanded access to early voting in the states that do not permit it. And number 3, we have to have preservation of in-person voting on Election Day without a reduction in polling places. The HEROES Act will accomplish all 3 of those things by giving the states the resources they need. And the reality, this isn't a partisan issue. We have Republican secretaries of state like Michael Adams in Kentucky, who has said that vote by mail is the safest way to vote. We've got Democrats who've been calling out the same. And we know that states across this country are being forced to slash their budgets because of the COVID pandemic. And that the reason we have a United States of America, the reason we have a federal system, is that it's the responsibility of the federal government to step in moments of crisis like a pandemic and support the states in executing the constitutionally required November election. These are things that can be done, but we have to put aside partisanship to make sure it happens.
Should every American get a mail-in ballot in the mail without having to request one?
Every American who is eligible to vote should receive a ballot that is postage paid. That is absolutely the right thing to do. That would be the gold standard. But I live in reality. And so what I'm asking for is that we remove as many of the barriers as possible, that we put guardrails in place to ensure that everyone who wants to vote by mail can do so. However, we have to remember that not everyone can or should vote by mail. If you are disabled, if you have a language barrier, if you have legitimate, if you are homeless, if you've been displaced by COVID, there are a number of communities that simply don't have the right or the capacity to vote by mail, and they need to be able to go in person. And that's why we can't simply focus on vote by mail. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, do vote by mail, in-person early voting, and election day voting without a closure of precincts.
I hear you on this, Leader Abrams, but I got to press you here because we're just, a couple of months away from the election. And, I'm curious whether or not the bureaucracy in the federal government, at the U.S. Postal Service, for example, whether or not they are actually prepared to handle the influx number of ballots that could be coming their way. How do we guarantee that the institutions that are really going to be on the front lines of counting the votes for democracy are adequately prepared for the potential of a massive increase in mail-in votes?
We start now. We make certain that our Congress acts now. The House has taken action. If the Senate passes the HEROES Act, it includes the guardrails we need, includes the resources we need to make certain that the U.S. Postal Service isn't weaponized by Donald Trump to block access to the right to vote. It ensures that states and local governments have the resources they need to scale up absentee balloting. It ensures that we have the poll workers we need to do this process. But we also have to tell people it's going to take longer than 11 p.m. on election night to know the answer. When in the midst of crisis, we have to adapt. And that adaptation is not only possible, it is necessary. We also know that every single state in the country has the capacity and the infrastructure for mail-in voting. This is about scale, not about capacity. And if we get the resources to scale this up, as Vice President Biden has called for, as Republicans and Democrats have called for, if we do what Tom Ridge, a Republican, has called for, and what good Democrats and Republicans are calling for across the country, we can make this work.
Coming up, it took Washington State 20 years to enact statewide mail-in voting. Can the nation do it in a matter of weeks? This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to this Bloomberg television special, 2020 Year of Crisis, Vote from Home. I'm Kevin Cirilli. This November, you may very well be casting your ballot by mail, but how you receive and send in your ballot depends greatly on where you live. And as Election Day looms, this patchwork of voting rules is creating new uncertainty as Americans pick a president.
If you live in one of these 7 states or the District of Columbia, officials will send a ballot to all registered voters automatically. In these 8 states, the government plans to send vote-by-mail applications to all residents. And in 27 states, voters can apply to vote by mail without giving any excuse, or by saying they are concerned about coronavirus. But as of right now, in these 8 states, you must have an excuse other than fear of coronavirus to receive an absentee ballot. While 77% of Americans can currently cast a ballot by mail, in order to count all of those absentee ballots in time, local officials will need more money, a lot more. According to some widespread voting by mail will cost between $982 million and $1.4 billion, with about half of that going to postage costs alone. And it's still not clear that states will be able to scale up in time. According to 538, in 2018, 29 states plus Washington, D.C. mailed out ballots to fewer than 10% of registered voters. And in many swing states like Florida, where 25% of residents voted by mail in 2016 and 2018, there simply isn't the political will or money to invest in vote-by-mail technology, when a single vote tabulator can cost up to $1 million.
Also adding to the uncertainty, the cost of the November election. For more on this, I spoke with Larry Norden, director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center.
The Brennan Center has estimated there's about an extra $3.5 billion cost to make all the adjustments are needed. And I want to be clear, that's for building up the infrastructure that we need for mail voting around the country and hiring a lot of extra workers to process mail ballots and to count them. One of the problems in the primaries was we were so slow in some jurisdictions in processing that vast surge that we got in mail ballots. But it's also to make sure that in-person voting is safe and secure. We've got to hire extra poll workers. We had lots of poll workers canceling. We've got to make sure that those polling places are safe and secure, both for poll workers so that they have the PPE that they need, and for voters, that there's social distancing, that there's that the voting period is extended so that we don't have the kind of crowding that we saw on Election Day in Atlanta and Wisconsin with 6-7 hour lines.
Does the United States Postal Service have a wing within its organization that specifically is to deal with the infrastructure for mail-in voting?
Yeah, there actually is an infrastructure to a certain extent within the post office for dealing with mail voting. And prior to this year, there's been a lot of communication between the post office and election officials who that do a lot of where there's historically been a lot of mail voting in terms of how to ensure that mail ballots get delivered in a timely way. I am worried about the potential politicization of the post office around this issue. I am worried about the delays that we've been seeing lately in mail delivery. And I would like to see the Postmaster General in particular come out and make clear that there's going to be an institutional dedication to ensuring that mail ballots are delivered in a timely way. And I also think that there are some things that election officials, counties and states can do to make sure that voters have the opportunity to cast their mail ballots, even if there are problems with the post office this fall. So one of the big things I think that I'd like to see localities and states do is start putting in more drop boxes so that people can drop off their mail ballot, even if they're concerned that there may be problems getting that mail ballot back to the post office. And in fact, if you look at states like Colorado or Washington State, where virtually everybody votes by mail, as they say they vote by mail, in actuality, most people are getting their ballot in the mail, but they're returning it through a drop box. And I'd like to see that throughout the country so people really have that option.
As many states and the federal government rush to plan for the election, the few states that have already embraced large-scale mail-in voting are being looked to as a guide. I spoke with the Washington Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, who told me that it took 20 years for Washington to fully transition to a vote-by-mail system.
I don't think there's enough time for every state to completely move to vote by mail. I think that's an unrealistic choice. I think that each state is going to have some sort of hybrid model that will have varying degrees of voting in person and voting at home. And that's really what we should be striving for, is what they can accomplish and how they can get there.
Secretary Wyman, how is this going to impact how Americans find out who won their election on Election Day?
Well, one of my biggest concerns right now, on top of all of the others, is that a large number of mail-in ballots are going to be coming into states, even including mine, election week. And that's going to slow down processing. So in Washington, for example, half of our ballots come in on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of election week, because we have a postmark requirement. As long as a voter gets a postmark before Election Day or on Election Day, we can count the ballot. What that means in my state is probably anywhere from 2 to 2.5 million ballots will come in election week. And we'll have to process those, which means even if we did everything perfectly, we still have so many outstanding ballots that we won't know who the winner is in many races until probably Friday of election week. If it's a close
Friday
race,
of election week.
Friday of election week. And this is
do you think the country is prepared for that, to be that patient for the results? A lot can happen in terms of the national conversation as time goes on.
Absolutely. And that's the heart of the issue, is that we need to start preparing voters right now, campaigns, media persons, that this is normal and we want to make sure we're accurate in the count, and we have to be very transparent of how we're doing it. But people should anticipate that it's going to take a long time, and it is not a nefarious activity. It is the normal election process.
So when will we know who won the election? Your estimate?
My estimate is it will probably be the 3rd or 4th week of November.
You said you have other concerns. What else is on your radar?
Oh boy. Well, a number of things. One is just whether or not the local jurisdictions that conduct elections have enough resources to be able to deal with the large increase, not only in volume of absentee ballots, but also the poll site voters who need to go in person. And even in Washington State, where the vast majority of our voters go and vote at home, we still have 1% to 2% of our voters who are going to need to show up at a polling place to register or to cast a ballot on an assisted device. So when you have that environment, you have to plan for 1% to 2% of your voters casting a ballot in person. In our state, that's going to mean about 50,000 people who show up probably on Monday or Tuesday of election week.
Coming up, as mail-in voting becomes a partisan issue, we'll take a look at why this election could become the most litigious in modern history. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to our special 2020 Year of Crisis, Vote from Home. I'm Kevin Cirilli. With Election Day approaching fast and statewide mail-in voting looking less viable, local officials are looking to prepare their districts as best they can. Over the past few months, voters across the nation have voted in person, but their reactions and experiences in the voting booth have been varied.
It just doesn't feel like it was the safest decision to do. I saw a lot of elderly voters, people who are high risk.
It's always important to come out and vote. It's part of our democratic rights here in the United States of America. It's really important specifically for voting for your community.
I would think that if we can hang on to the right to vote during catastrophes, that would be a feather in all of our caps if we could maintain our cool.
I'm a little bit angry that people are even put in the position that we are, both as workers and voters.
Because of some of this anger and uncertainty, the push for more widespread mail-in voting is growing, but some conservatives are still strongly against the idea. Hans von Spakovsky, manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative at the Heritage Foundation, says that trying to scale up mail-in voting for the November election is impossible.
There's two big issues. Okay, first of all, the problem with absentee or mail-in balloting is they're the ones that are most vulnerable to being stolen, altered, forged, and to voters having undue pressure brought on them. You know, the problem with it is this. Look, electioneering is prohibited in all of the states inside polling places. So a campaign staff or candidate can't come into a polling place and try to pressure you into voting a particular way. Those rules don't apply to people's homes. And there's plenty of evidence in prior cases of that kind of thing happening. But look, the other big problem is you're handing over the election to the U.S. Postal Service. And all you have to do is look at recent primaries in District of Columbia, Maryland, Wisconsin, New York, and you'll see all kinds of problems with absentee ballots that were requested by voters not being delivered by the Postal Service in time to be voted. Plus, you have a huge rejection problem, and that doesn't happen in polling places, particularly the technical issues, because you've got an election official there who can try to remedy any potential problems with the voter.
Walk us through some of the litigation that we could see this November.
Well, I think you'll see some of the litigation that already is apparently occurring in New York because of their primary. I think you're going to see litigation potentially by losing candidates and others over the rejection of ballots. You know, if ballots have been rejected because, for example, the signature doesn't comply, it doesn't match on the absentee ballot with the signature of the voter on file, folks may sue saying the analysis of that was wrongly done by election officials. Or if election officials are rejecting ballots because they don't meet technical specifications. In other words, they don't provide all the information that's supposedly required. Again, I think you may see litigation saying that those requirements should be waived because they're insubstantial and not important to whether the vote should be counted.
When do you think we'll know who won the presidential election? Will it be November 3rd, the night of, or will it be sometime later in the month of November?
I think that depends entirely on what state election officials decide to do. As you probably know, right now, there's something like 150 lawsuits across the country trying to change the rules. And election officials still have not made a final decision on how many polling places they're going to have open or how much mail-in ballots they're going to have, or they're going to switch entirely to that. So if there's a huge increase in mail-in balloting, I think the results will be delayed because it takes so much longer to count and process those ballots. If election officials try to have as many polling places open as they usually do, then I think we will get results very quickly.
Uncertainty continues to swirl around the November 3rd election. Rick Hasson is a professor at the University of California at Irvine and author of the book Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. He says there is minimal risk from an increase in postal voting.
The rates of absentee ballot fraud are rare, and there are safeguards that states have in place, like signature verification, electronic ballot tracking. In many states, you can watch your ballot go from it being sent out by the government to it being returned after you voted it. So there are procedures in place. And of course, everyone's going to be watching for problems. So I really think that, yes, it's true, there is a slightly elevated risk of fraud associated with absentee ballots, but the alternative is one of potentially disenfranchising millions of Americans who may not have a safe in-person option for voting.
And just clear this up for us. What's the difference between a mail-in voting and absentee voting?
There's not really any difference between calling it absentee and mail-in. Each state has their own terminology. But the point is, a ballot is mailed to you, and you return it either by putting it in the U.S. mail or bringing it to a drop box or bringing it to a polling location. I think the president's trying to thread a needle here. On the one hand, he's trying to cast doubts about the integrity of the process of voting by mail. On the other hand, Republicans know that this is a way that many of their voters like to vote and are used to voting, and they're worried about a decline in turnout if the president is discouraging this.
You mentioned about how, different states call this different things. So that could mean, could it not, that we could be in for a long legal battle in the month of November? What are some of the legal cases that could come from this after Election Day at the presidential level?
I think if the election is very close, you're likely to see fights over whether particular absentee ballots should be counted, whether polling place time should be extended, what the rules should be for dealing with ballots that are rejected. So there are going to be all kinds of ballots that will be in question. If there's a large margin between the candidates, or if the Electoral College is not really in play, it's not going to focus national attention. But if it is a really close election, then as I argue in Election Meltdown, the focus is going to be on the weakest links.
That wraps up this special report, 2020, Year of Crisis, Vote from Home. Be sure to tune into Bloomberg Television and Radio for the latest information, news, and analysis 24 hours a day. Stay safe, everyone. I'm Kevin Cirilli. This is Bloomberg.